Hello, welcome to this video tutorial, how to answer 10 markers with items. My name is Mrs. Cook. I'm an A-level sociology teacher and examiner for AQA. So let's get into this. So first of all, it's worth noting that this question appears on paper 1, 2 and 3. And according to AQA, these questions will have an item that is closely linked to the question. An item is a paragraph or a couple of sentences inside of a box, and it will always be labelled as item. You will see that the question will always ask you applying material from item, and it could be item A, B, C, depending on where you are in the paper. Analyse to. We just don't know what's going to come up. It could be analysing to lots of different things, analysing to reasons, to ways, to criticisms. The item will encourage you to link two elements from either the same or different bullet points from the spec. So you might get an analyse to question that's very straightforward. Analyse two reasons why official crime statistics may produce a dark figure of crime. So taking from one part of the specification on measuring crime. However, what's quite tricky is when they actually combine two different topics or chapters from your specification. So it could be something like analyse two Marxist approaches to understanding the dark figure of crime. So they've linked Marxist ideas on crime and deviance from your topic when you looked at the role and purpose of crime in society with measuring crime. The item will contain hooks, and that is really important. If you want to get an A star, you must practice these questions by practicing looking for those hooks. So in the box where they will give you a couple of sentences, you have to find the hooks, and the hooks are hints at what you could talk about, and you're going to have to hook onto that and develop it in two different ways. So there should be two hooks. Sometimes you can use the same hook and develop it in two different ways, but I encourage my students to look for two different hooks. And we'll get onto that. I'm going to show you an example of an item and exactly what a hook looks like. So before we look at an example question, it's really important that you look at mark schemes because they give away a lot of information. As you can see, if you write no relevant points, you're going to get 0. But apart from that, there are 3 major bands, 1 to 3, 4 to 7 and 8 to 10. The vast majority of students fall into that mid band, the 4 to 7, because it's a basic or reasonable level of knowledge and understanding. It's a basic or reasonable level of application, maybe one application from the item, so one hook, and some hints of trying to explain it, that analysis and evaluation. Maybe there's no evaluation at all. What we're aiming for is to get into that top band, the 8 to 10s. And here we have to show good knowledge, good understanding, relevant material, developed applications of those hooks from the item, and appropriate analysis and evaluation of 2 of the hooks. Now, this mark scheme is just taken from a past question, but the principle here is that we need to know how to showcase good knowledge, how to showcase applications from the item, and how do we make sure our analysis and evaluation is developed and appropriate. So basically, if you want to show good knowledge and understanding of the relevant material, you've got to link your hook that you've picked from the item to relevant concepts, studies and examples. It's got to have a good knowledge and understanding of relevant concepts, relevant theory, relevant studies that support the claim made in the question. You've got to take 2 different hooks and link that to what you've learned. So hook onto it and explain it in the most detailed way. Link it to a theory. There'll be hints of the answers. They want you to join the dots. They want you to connect the hook to a theory, to a perspective, to an idea or an example, a reason that you would have learned during your 2 years studying sociology. Your chain of reasoning has to be developed, so it's not brief. These answers don't tend to be brief. So if you are not using more than a page to answer your 10 marker item questions, your chain of reasoning is far too short. I use a rule in my class where I say not 5, not fine. And what that means is When you get to the part of your answer where you're explaining a point and you're bringing in a theory or bringing in a study and you're unpacking a concept to explain something, make sure you're aiming for more than 5 sentences, because to get into the top band, if you want to showcase good knowledge and understanding, it will take you, if you're an A-star student, more than 5 sentences to do that before you then get on to your evaluation. Now, we have touched upon this already, but I'm going to reiterate it because it is a point worth reiterating. Be aware of cross-topic 10 markers. They are really tricky. They're tricky because you can't really predict them. The only way you can prepare is to use these kind of matrix grids. So what are they? Cross-topic 10 markers are where the examiner has formulated a question, so using material from the item, analyse to, and the analyse to part of the question will combine 2 topic areas that you probably haven't really necessarily looked at in combination. So, for example, if we use this grid on screen now, this is education. And what you've got down the left-hand side are topics and across mirrored topics. And what you can do is practice in your peer groups, combining 2 chapters that perhaps you haven't previously seen. Say, for instance, we could go to the function of education, the role and function, and that's where all your theory is. And then you could go across to educational policy. And so you could formulate your own 10 marker, you could come up with your own item where there are 2 hooks, and you could practice a question such as analyse 2 feminist perspectives on the role of educational policy. So you wouldn't necessarily have covered that in class. So these questions are testing your application of knowledge, and they are far harder. But you can prepare for these by simply doing as many combinations and getting your teachers to mark them. Okay, how do I structure my answer? So an A-star student would know this already, no introduction. Do not waste your time on the 10 marker with item questions using an introduction. It is not needed. You will need 2 paragraphs, and they should follow some kind of structure like a Peely structure. So making a point, explain that point, back it up with examples, link back to the question and the hook before you evaluate explicitly. You've got to do that twice, and you have 15 minutes to answer this question because it's 10 marks. So 7.5 minutes per hook that you're going to have to formulate a paragraph to match. Now, I tend to promote, not Tesco, but promote this way of checking whether your paragraphs are any good. Best paragraphs, A-star students tend to go shopping in Tesco. That's how I tell it to my students. What do I mean by this? Well, when you're constructing your Peely paragraph and you've picked your hook, and we'll get on to how we do the hooks in a second, the best paragraphs have the following shopping in them. They have a theoretical foundation, okay, a link to a theory. They have explicit evaluation at the end, not juxtaposition. They have at least 1 study. They have concepts in every other line. So the language that they've been learning for the last 2 years, they use that specialist language, the specialist terms. And they have obvious examples of the impact or obvious real life examples to back up what the perspective is saying. So Tesco is my way of kind of quality ensuring that the paragraph is A-star quality. And last but not least, you do not need a conclusion. So no introduction and no conclusion. So this is the question that came up in summer of 2025. And I want to show you what an item looks like and what hooks look like. Now, this is one of my past students, and what I love about this is how much they've doodled over it, because it tells me that the person didn't just go straight in with an answer, they practiced, they planned. So I encourage you to do that. So this is an example of an item. So you only have about 3 or 4 sentences. So item A says, teachers may have different expectations of some groups of pupils compared to others. Pupils may form subcultures with peers who share similar values. Relationships and processes within school may lead to gender differences in achievement. So 3 or 4 sentences in an item. Let's have a look at the question then. Apply material from that item analyse 2 ways in which relationships and processes within schools may lead to gender differences in educational achievement. So that's the question, and the answers are in the hook, or at least hints in the item that they want you to hook onto. So if we look at the item, this question is basically saying, what are the inside factors, 2 different inside factors that could lead to gender differences in achievement? So as you can see, the student here has underlined 2 separate parts of the item, different expectations and subcultures. And if you think back to your education topics of inside factors and gender, you would have looked at different expectations linked to labelling theory, and you would have looked at pupil responses in the form of subcultures and linked that to gender differences. So the example I'm going to show you is of a past student who wrote this answer, and they got 9 out of 10. So top band A star quality. And we're going to look at that first hook, different expectations. And we're going to apply that Peely paragraph, and we're going to check the shopping that they've done in Tesco as well. So let's get on with it. Okay, let's have a look at what this student has done to get an A star. The first thing they've done is made it blindingly obvious to the examiner what part of the item they are going to hook onto. So item A states, teachers may have different expectations of pupils. And I tell my students, make sure in the first sentence you quote the item. Now they are going to explain that hook, different expectations of pupils. They're going to link it to theory, they're going to link it to studies and concepts to try, hopefully, to explain gender differences in achievement. So this can be linked to labelling theory, Becker, which is the idea that teachers attach labels to pupils and treat them accordingly. For example, place boys into lower sets than girls based on stereotypical expectations. So already they've gone shopping down the T aisle because they've linked it to labelling theory. So they've identified what the examiner would expect, which is expectations would have been taught alongside labelling theory in your classes. They've also gone down the S aisle because they've got a study, one of the most famous sociologists linked to labelling theory, one of the most famous sociologists linked with teacher expectations. And they've already given an obvious example of what an expectation of a pupil might lead to, which is being placed in different sets. Look at the chain of reasoning. Look at how long this student has taken to explain this. So Archer identifies white female middle class pupils are more likely to be seen as the ideal pupil as they are socialised into the bedroom culture. This means they are socialised into being passive and obedient. These qualities, which are valued by teachers as they themselves are most likely middle class, meaning they share the same habitus, leads to symbolic capital and being put into top sets with access to higher grades. So if we just stop there and pause, already in those 3 or 4 sentences, we have another study, we have several concepts, and we have obvious examples of higher grade access because they've mentioned sets again. They've been much more specific on the type of female, so white middle class, and they've linked it to an inside factor of habitus and of symbolic capital. So already conceptually detailed. We carry on. However, as French identified, boys receive more attention from teachers, but this is often negative attention. This is because boys are labelled as more boisterous and less organised, and therefore struggle to be successful in classroom tasks, such as pair work, class discussions. They want to dominate the discussion and will not listen to what others have to say. Boys are more likely to be placed into bottom sets and be entered for lower tier exams, and therefore not achieve the highest grades. So if we pause there again, what you've got now is a comparison to what boys are like. What expectations do teachers have of boys? So they take us through a really important study of French and how the expectation is that they are going to need more attention, but it's often negative attention. You've got obvious examples of how that is negative. Okay, so they're more likely to be stereotyped as boisterous, less organised, struggle in classroom situations. So it's all building up to how this impacts on achievement. And right at the end, they say, therefore, they're, likely to be put into lower tier exams and not achieve the highest grades. So again, we've got that link back to achievement. This means that girls are more suited to the school environment, which may explain why they tend to achieve more highly in education than boys. So a nice link back to the question on achievement. The last thing you need to do is to evaluate, and you have to do this explicitly. So this person has put, however, the idea that girls are passive does not apply to working class girls who have a hyper heterosexual feminine identity, which means they place more value on their social lives and appearance, like identities, than their education, meaning they achieve low grades as often they are placed into lower sets and entered for lower tier exams. So more analysis there, more of an understanding that this isn't just straightforward girls do outperform boys, because what they're doing here is adding detail to the fact that when you add in class, the picture is very, very different. And they've also got a concept to use here, heterosexual feminine identity, and they use that really well. They follow it up with Nike identities. So it isn't a very brief, however, comment. It is ticking lots of boxes. So if we just stop and say, right, what shopping has taken place here? You've got theory, you've got explicit evaluation, you've got studies, you've got concepts, and you've got obvious examples of expectations and behaviours and links to achievement. So you can see why this clearly is a top band answer. So it'll be interesting to see what their second hook is. So we go back to the example question and we go back to the item. You can see that the second part of the item that's been underlined is subcultures. So we've now got to construct a paragraph where we link subcultures to differences in gender and achievement. So let's have a look at how the student does it. So you'll notice the first thing they've done is item A states, and they have quoted from the item. So that's ensuring the examiner can tell that they have used the hook. Explain what you mean then. So this can be linked to the idea that there is pressure from peer groups to conform to what they perceive as the norm. So they're unpacking peer pressure. Epstein explores how male peer groups influence attitudes towards education. He argues that if boys value education, they become subject to homophobic language, such as being called sissies. This acts as motivation for boys, especially working class boys, to reject the school system and join an anti-school subculture in which status, or symbolic capital, is achieved through disruptive behaviour in class rather than doing homework and truancy. This causes boys to have symbolic violence with teachers as they do not have the same habitus as the school system, therefore leading to boys being excluded and therefore missing out on lessons, leading to underachievement. So this paragraph is shorter, but it ticks a lot of the boxes. You've got the second hook clearly identified at the start. You've got a relationship that is an inside factor clearly identified, peer pressure in peer groups. You've got Epstein as a study, and you've got obvious examples of the impact of joining an anti-school subculture. You've got lots of concepts, symbolic capital, obvious examples of them, not doing their homework and truancy. So the link to achievement is really well stated. Now the evaluation has to be explicit to get into the top band again. So this can be criticised by Mitsos and Brown. So we've got another study who found that male peer groups value academic success in sixth form and want to achieve. This means this perspective is deterministic. Not all boys at all stages of education will react the same. This is a common error when looking at a micro level theory to understand achievement. So again, we've got T right at the end, theory, we've got explicit evaluation, we've got two studies, we've got concepts and lots of obvious examples of what boys are doing inside a school that could lead to them underachieving. So I hope this has been helpful. What's important is that you learn how to look for hooks, pick the hooks out, and then think to yourself, how can I explain this hook in the most conceptually detailed way with an evaluation at the end. I hope it's been helpful.